All right, today we're going to go over squat progression with my lovely pal Erica here. She's going to be demonstrating all the squats we're going to be doing. We're going to go over first bodyweight squat, goblet squat, and then your traditional back squat. These are good things that we introduce to new lifters. We start with the bodyweight squat to check their movement patterns, make sure everything's right. We're going to make sure their knees are pointing outwards, their knees are tracking over their toes, their squat is all the way down parallel, make sure they're getting all their depth and they're not rounded back. Those are the things you look for on the very first movement, which is the bodyweight squat. So Erica, just go ahead and demo a bodyweight squat with hands on your hips. There we go. Just keep going, multiple repetitions. As we watch, we'll really make sure we're looking that she gets her depth, and the way you check for her depth is to make sure that her crease of her thighs are coming down to her calves right here. Good. And then as she goes down, so go down and hold. We notice that her knees are not over top of her toes, they're tracking, they're pointing out. So come back up, give me an example of when your knees would come in. That is not what you want. Brad, you want to get a shot at that in the front. Do that one more time. Good. And as you can come back up, as lifters start getting heavier lifts and with goblet squats or back squats or front squats, the harder the lift, the heavier the weight, the more their knees are going to want to track in just on biomechanical weight tracking. So you really would need to focus on pushing the knees out. That is a really big injury risk. So now we're going to move to goblet squats. This is our progression. We'd go and hold a goblet squat, just like it sounds, holding the goblet. And the reason we start with this instead of a back squat, it's easier to hold, it's easier to feel weight in their body rather than just loading their spine with the barbell right away. So give me a couple reps of the goblet squat. The big thing with goblet squat is you really don't want her body tilting forward. You want to make sure she's staying vertical, straight up and down. The big issue with the goblet squats is a lot of athletes want to tilt forward as they start lifting. They're going to do this because that's where the weight's pulling them. You really need to make sure they focus on staying straight up and down, straight vertical. So give me another good example. Good, I'll give you a bad example. Good. That turns into start looking like a good morning, and that's not exactly what you want. So you can put the weight down. Move on to our traditional back squat. Normally, our back squats are in racks with squat racks, but because of our resources right now, we're just use a barbell, a free barbell, which is perfectly fine. It's actually probably good to start beginners off with this instead of having them be under racks. Once athletes get under racks, they can be a little intimidated. So with this, you really need to make sure that the first thing to go, you want the athlete to hinge at the hip and push the hips back when they squat. So hinge and then squat backwards. You still want to make sure they're vertical. Make sure their knees are tracking over their toes, and make sure they're getting their good depth all the way down to parallel. With back squat compared to a goblet squat, it's going to look more backwards instead of straight up and down because that's just where the weight is. In goblet squat, the first thing you really do is just squat down. With the back squat, a lot of people talk about sitting on a toilet. If you can sit on a toilet, you can back squat. So you want to really reach your butt back, act like you're not going to miss that toilet, squat down, get to parallel, come back up. Give me some good examples. Good. Erica does a really good job getting her good depth, pushing her knees out, and making sure her butt reaches back. Now, a lot of things that you may see in young athletes who really worry about getting their depth is a butt wink. So go really as low as you possibly go. A butt wink is where her butt will literally tuck under and then come back up. You can come back up now. Thank you. So you really, to focus on not making sure athletes' butt winks, just tell them to come to parallel. Don't go any lower. If any lower, you'll start getting that Tillman effect, and that puts a lot of stress on your lower back. And when you come up, it puts a lot of stress on your knees. So you need to make sure, if they are butt winking, have the athlete just stop in parallel. Maybe some isometric holds down there would really help. Give me 2 more. Just regular good squats. Good. Also notice how her head and neck are looking straight. Sometimes athletes will crank their neck back when they squat, because a lot of times people will cue to look up, but the young athletes like to over-exaggerate everything. So they will crank their neck up and they'll squat, and that'll make them lose their balance and fall backwards. So it's a good cue to look upwards to make sure your chest rises, but as you squat, make sure your head stays neutral on that bar and you don't crank and you stay straight. Another good cue, so say Erica squats down and her chest, when she gets to the bottom, she starts to lift, the first thing to come would be her hips instead of her back. So come down, and then pretty much go from there, act like you're gonna do a good morning. So that is bad form that we really do not want that. One really good cue to help fix that issue is when the athlete goes down and you notice that their chest is dropping every time they get there. One, the weight may be too heavy, but two, when they get the bottom, tell them to squeeze the bar, crank their elbows up. That motion of cranking your elbows forward will keep your chest up, and it'll make the first thing your chest rise instead of turning the squat into a good morning, which is what we don't want. So give me an example, a bad example. Good. Give me one more good example. Crank your elbows forward, good. The farther she cranks her elbows, the higher her chest gets, the better her squat will be. Also, with feet placement, a lot of times athletes are worried about where they want to stand, wide, narrow. I like to say, sit where you're comfortable. Most of the time they're going to be in athletic position, and it's okay to turn their toes out. A lot of athletes like to stay narrow-toed or even a little bit in. Turn your toes out a tad bit, squat down normal. That helps your knees track over top of your toes. And then a good cue to really help with the knees, since that's a big issue with younger athletes. A lot of people say corkscrew your feet. So act like you're corkscrewing the ground, your feet into the ground. Or another cue is rip the floor apart. So as you're coming down, think about there's a piece of paper on the floor, you want to rip it apart, that makes your knees push out. So give me a good example of really trying to push your knees out. Rip the floor, that's what you would say if the athlete was struggling with their knees. So give me a bad knee example, rip the floor. One more time, rip the floor, good. Another big important factor of squats with form is making sure our athletes are really pushing through their heels. But as we cue, I know a lot of coaches that say push through the midsection of your foot, because not the heel, because what is the first thing an athlete's going to do when you say push through your heel? They're going to want to lean back and have their toes raised. And with heavy weight on their back, that is not ideal. Another good thing you don't want them to do is not be on their toes with their heels raised. That's just not a balanced position. It's not a strong position for them to squat in. So have them push through the midsection of their foot, really have a solid base, and when they come down, say drive through their heels, drive their feet through the floor, and that'll keep them in a good solid position to be a strong squatter and not be in an unhealthy position. When we design workouts in our exercise programs, we have each block specifically designed for a reason. We start with our power blocks, our strength blocks, and our accessory blocks. The reason why our squats are in our strength block, and these are normally at the beginning of our workouts. Our power block is our most central nervous system fatiguing exercises, so we want those first. Our strength blocks are then going to be a muscular demanding exercises. That's why you want them second. The reason we don't put our squats at the end of the workouts, that's when our athletes are mostly tired, and that's when our squats are most demanding exercises, so they're going to need their most strength for that exercise. So you don't want to put a squat at the end, unless you're doing something like a body weight squat or a burnout squat for accessory or just fatiguing the muscles completely at the end of an exercise. So we put our squats at the beginning. We normally want our rep ranges, depending on our percentages, anywhere, if you're a hypertrophy phase, you want it from 8 to 12, a strength phase, anywhere from 3 to 5, endurance phase, 15 to 20. The reason we have each different categories for each muscle groups, and depending on what your athlete needs, if it's a tennis or football, obviously they're going to need two completely different types of squat rep ranges. With our tennis, they're more endurance athletes. They need to be on the court, running back and forth longer. They'll be more on the endurance side. In regards to football, they're more strength power athlete. They need to be on the lower 3 to 5 rep ranges. Each rep ranges will equal a different intensity. With our tennis, you're obviously not going to squat 15 to 20 reps at a 95%, but with our football, at a 3 to 5 rep range, you can squat a lot heavier weight. And that's why each athlete will have different rep ranges and different intensities for the exercise with the squat. That is all we have for the squats.